announcement of iOS 14 taking place just a few weeks ago, it's always nice to look back and see how far we've come. Apple's mobile operating system hasn't always been the colourful, cartoon-style interface that it is now, and up until late 2013 it was vastly different from what we see today. iOS 6 is one of the most iconic versions of Apple software, and also one of the last remnants of the Steve Jobs era.
Hello everyone, welcome back to TechSpree, and I hope you're all doing well. Today, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most iconic and well-known retro software versions created by Apple, iOS 6.
Released all the way back in 2012, this version was the last to carry the 3D, realistic style design rather than the colourful 2D interface we see today. It shipped with the iPhone 5 and was compatible with the iPhone 3GS, 4, 4S and 5, iPad 2, 3 and 4, as well as the first gen iPad mini and the iPod Touch 4th and 5th gen. This was the last version of the classic retro iOS interface under the reign of Steve Jobs, with the 3D app icons and buttons as well as the old animations and gestures that were removed the following year upon the debut of iOS 7. Taking a quick look at the home screen on iOS 6 versus iOS 7, we can see that iOS 6 looks 3D with realistic retro-style app icons, meanwhile iOS 7 is colourful and minimalistic. For example, the camera app on iOS 6 looks like a real camera lens with all the different shades and lines, and even the reflection of the glass in the lens. Just look at how detailed that is. On modern software, however, it's a simple animated picture of a camera with clean, crisp lines and only 3 colours. Now, the retro vibe of iOS 6 still continues within apps. For example, in the Notes app, the pages look like an actual notebook with yellow paper and lines as well as a handwriting style font. In contrast, the modern Notes app looks kind of plain, with a textured background being the only connection to the older version. On the Newsstand app, a woody textured bookshelf is displayed with tons of detail. They've got it down to every last line and imperfection of real wood, and it looks so appealing compared to the modern News app, which looks like, well, a plain white interface with a few digital headlines. The styling of iOS 6 was so beautiful, and it's too bad that we'll most likely not see anything like this again from Apple. Now, I'm not trying to diss iOS 13 and 14 in any way. I think it looks really fun and colourful, and iOS 14 is going to be amazing, but iOS 6 just had so much class to it, and I'm such a huge fan of its appearance. Also, you can actually jailbreak any modern device to get the looks of iOS 6, but personally, I'm not really into jailbreaking because of security concerns, but otherwise I'd probably go for it. Another thing that's changed since iOS 6 is gestures and features. For example, the app switcher on iOS 6 appears as a row of app icons that you close by holding down on and pressing the X button, similar to deleting an app normally. However, on the modern system, the app switcher brings out a carousel of rectangular app interfaces, and they can be closed in the background by swiping up on them. Something else that was introduced the following year and is still seen today is swiping to go back in apps like Settings and Mail. From iOS 7 and forward, swiping to the right from the left-hand side of the screen takes you back to the previous menu, but in iOS 6 there was none of this, and you had to click the back button to get to the previous screen, because back in the day, navigating your phone took blood, sweat and tears. Another feature that is different on iOS 6 compared to 13 and 14 is the search function. Today, swiping down on the home screen brings up a search bar so that you can quickly search the internet or open an app. Adversely, on iOS 6, swiping to the right of the home screen brings up the search bar in an entire different page.
Just another thing I'd like to point out is the sounds on iOS 6. I bet you that most kids born after 2005 won't recognize this sound. I mean, just listen to that. To be honest, the Lockscreen Sound is kind of one of the most satisfying parts of iOS 6. This sound was unfortunately removed come iOS 7, and then Slide to Unlock was completely obliterated come iOS 10, which introduced Press Home to unlock.
The old style typing clicks and lock sound are also present on iOS 6, but they too were killed off come iOS 10.
But what do iOS 6 and iOS 13 and 14 have in common? Well, actually, modern iOS shares a few of its features with iOS 6.
For example, there is sort of an early version of Control Center present on iOS 6 before they made it a big thing in iOS 7. I guess they were just testing the waters. You can access it by double pressing the home button and then swiping to the right on the app switcher. Here you'll find some plain pause controls for your Carly Rae Jepsen tracks back in 2012, along with an on-screen volume control if you swipe right again. Trust me, call me maybe, it's different on 8-year-old software. Those were the only things you could do with it at the time, and Control Center customization didn't even appear until iOS 11. Nevertheless, it's a great little knickknack, and I guess Apple had their eye on it and decided it had more potential, so they made it a quick way you could control things like brightness in iOS 7.
Control Center is still very present on modern software, and as I said earlier, you can now customize the widgets on it to have features that are important to you.
So yeah, iOS 6 was such a timeless classic interface and will always be remembered as one of the best versions of Apple's mobile operating system. I'm not really against iOS 13 and its colourful array of apps and buttons, but it would be nice to see the old style again, although I doubt we ever will.
But 8 years later, with iOS 14 being released to the public in a few months, how obsolete has iOS 6 become over the years? And is it possible to use a device running it as your daily driver? Let's find out. Oh, by the way, the phone featured in this video is a 4S running iOS 6.1.3, however it was previously on iOS 9.3.5, an update this phone should never have gotten. iOS 9 completely ruined the experience of the 4S by making everything excruciatingly slow and was pretty much unusable. Last year though, you could downgrade your 4S from iOS 9 to iOS 6, which would vastly improve the performance, which I did, but Apple unfortunately unsigned this downgrade late last year, making it impossible. So yeah, I'm really glad I did this while I could.
So back to the question. First off, the design and aesthetic is something some will appreciate and some will just see as outdated. As I said earlier, I'm personally a fan of the retro spin and many others are too, and it really just boils down to individual preference. It does look vastly different from modern software, however it's got the same general layout with a favorites app section at the bottom as well as an array of icons with different pages. It still follows the same basic principles and gestures, but keep in mind that in other areas it's very different. For example, the app switcher, which I've previously talked about. There's something really quirky and timeless about iOS 6, and if you're a fan of the realistic aesthetic, you'll most likely enjoy using it. Next, let's talk about features, which is a pretty big factor in terms of usability today.
iOS 6 is very minimalist and primitive compared to modern day software, and you can't use features like AirDrop, Haptic Touch, Apple Music, or Live Photos.
Instead, everything feels very essential and like apps were made to do their job and only their job without any extra add-ons. For example, the Photos app is used solely to share and view photos, not to recognize contacts that are in your pictures or the location of the photo. Heck, you can't even see the date it was taken. Same thing goes for the Settings app. You get the options to adjust essential functions of the phone like brightness and wallpapers and Wi-Fi, etc. But there's no screen time or battery saver or anything like that, and this kind of shows how feature deprived this software is compared to iOS 13 and 14. So in terms of features, iOS 6 lacks a lot of modern ones, but still provides the essentials so that you can get by.
Now I hate to burst the iOS 6 bubble, but support for things is going to be this version's main killer in 2020.
You can't download most apps, and for the ones you can, their last compatible versions are basically from the Stone Age. Take Instagram for example. I mean, it works, but it's from that era where it had the old 3D camera logo along with the black and blue interface. It's really basic, and all you can do is view posts, like them, comment and search for profiles, but DMs don't work and neither do stories or viewing posts with multiple pictures past the first one. Despite this, some apps work really well, like the game Zombie Highway for example. This game runs amazingly and is perfect for anyone who wants a fun little game on an iOS 6 device. There are tons of apps out there still compatible with iOS 6, and I'll put a link in the description for a website that has a list of them all in case you want to download some.
But the thing is, with iOS 6, most modern services are not available, so you can't download things like Snapchat, YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter.
For movies and music, you've only got the iTunes store and the music app, since iTunes was used by basically everyone back then, but it doesn't work anymore, so that's unlucky.
So basically, compatibility is one of iOS 6's main killers in 2020. But to be fair, it is 8-year-old software, and so it's lucky we can even do the things I just discussed. Now despite all this, there are a few things that iOS 6 can do well in 2020.
For one, someone who doesn't really use apps or the internet and just kinda has their phone as a communication device could get by half decently. If you put the right size SIM in the phone, then that makes texting and calling available for iOS 6. iMessage is still compatible and calling works just as well as it does today, but it actually doesn't end there. Most of the stock apps actually work just fine, as long as they don't need internet. A great example of this is the calendar, reminders and notes apps. These all work just as fine as they did when iOS 6 was new. To push it even further, Safari should still work for mobile browsing as long as you have a good internet connection. Safari being compatible is actually really useful in this situation, as you can get onto mobile sites like Twitter, YouTube and Instagram, since you can't really get the apps anymore. Now depending on what site you're on, mobile browsing on iOS 6 can either be amazing or disastrous. Twitter here is working fine for me, and I can scroll through things, I can like things, I can pretty much do whatever. Another thing that still works with iOS 6 is Siri. Now, Siri was primitive back in 2012, but she can still tell you the weather, and voice dial people if you want. There is no voice command to activate it though, and if you want to find the nearest McDonald's using your voice, you'll just have to hold down the home button like in the good old days.
So in conclusion, how obsolete is iOS 6 in 2020? Well, my final answer is that for most people it's going to be utter garbage, but if you're willing to make some sacrifices and you know how to make stuff work, then it won't be as bad, but still not a pleasant experience.
It's cool to look back and see how far we've come, and iOS 6 was definitely one of Apple's best software creations.
But that being said, you really shouldn't be using this off your own accord, since it's really just too old to use daily. So that brings my review of iOS 6 in 2020 to an end. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe to TechSpree for a new video pretty much weekly and a free glass of water. My Twitter and Instagram are also in the description, so you should give them a follow too. By the way guys, I've noticed my channel start to grow a tiny bit, and I'd like to thank those who are subscribed for supporting my small channel and staying loyal, and it really means a lot to me, and I hope that one day we'll have 100k plus subs maybe. Once again guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.